Hello and welcome to this tutorial in which we will be covering a workflow from Rhino to Unity 3D for the purposes of creating a navigable architectural environment. We will be starting with a Rhino model that looks something like this. This is a rough approximation of the Carpenter Center by Le Corbusier. This is just what was available from the digital media workshops at the GSD. And by the end of this workshop, we will have an environment that looks something like this. This is again created in Unity 3D. This workshop will be split into likely 3 different videos, and the topics that we're going to be looking at include first the file preparation in Rhino before we export to Unity 3D. We'll be looking at the Unity 3D interface, how to create a new scene and import that geometry from Rhino. Next, we'll look at texturing, as well as lighting and environment properties. Finally, we're going to touch on character control and maybe some extras, and then finally publishing either for the web or for as a standalone exe. So before we do anything in Unity 3D, I'm just going to go over a few helpful tips in terms of file preparation before we export this geometry for use in Unity 3D. We've got essentially 5 materials in this model, or even only 4 if we think about kind of a ground plane. Again, it's an oversimplification of the building, but we're looking at ground plane, concrete, which is the majority of the structure, the dominant material in the building, then glass, glazing, and then finally this railing material that will be kind of a perforated mesh. So the first thing we want to make sure that we've done is that we've organized materials, or that we've organized layers by material. So we have this hierarchy here, this layer tree, where we split geometry based on floors, so we can remove an entire floor at a time if we want to look at, for example, the second floor, which is usually a good strategy. In addition to that, so I just happen to not be turning on floor 0, the basement floor. We're just not going to use that for this tutorial. Additionally, within each of these hierarchies, under each of these folders, essentially for levels, we have organized materials or layers by material. So essentially the column and the wall materials, or the wall layers, are going to receive the concrete material. Glazing will receive a glass material, and mullions will receive kind of a dark black metal, coated metal material. So it's important that we don't put anything on the wrong layer, because it's going to be very difficult to fix that in Unity. You essentially wouldn't want to fix it in Unity. You would want to come back to Rhino, fix it in Rhino, and then re-export as an OBJ into Unity. So it's not practical to expect that you'll get everything right the first time. It's usually a process of re-exporting a number of times after you've corrected various material naming or layer naming issues. And so what's essentially going to happen is when we export this as an OBJ, each layer, including each sublayer here, will get exported as an object, and that object will receive a specific texture in Unity. So with that in mind, that's the way that we're assigning textures. We need to make sure that we've organized everything by material. Another thing that we want to do is make sure that all of our what's called surface normals are facing the same way. The way that Unity works is, and basically all mesh rendering programs, is that they require the surface normal to be facing to the outside, that you basically only visualize the texture when you're looking at a direction opposite of the surface normal. So we can check this in Rhino if we use the command dir. When we do dir, we see that these arrows are pointing out from the surface. That means that the surface normals are all facing out. If they were facing in, that would mean that we wouldn't see this wall portrayed as a wall, but we would actually see kind of through it, and we would see the back or the inside of the wall, which wouldn't make sense, and it would seem like an error in the visualization. So um, maintaining uniformity in all the surface normals will probably take a couple of tries to get right. But if we model everything as closed solids, that's a safe start and a good way to guarantee that you will be mostly correct. So you'll see here that all of the walls in the building are modeled as essentially closed solids or joined extrusions. And do dir here, check the directionalities here. So we have always the arrows pointing to the outside of the surface. So what this means is that in Unity, this surface is going to be represented as it's one material as concrete, and it will have the same properties on the inside and outside. If you need to model walls that have a different interior finish than exterior finish, then it's best to offset those and extrude on a different layer, of course. And again, make sure the surface normals are always facing outwards or facing in the direction that you want to visualize those surfaces. Another thing that we want to make sure to do in Rhino, and again, not strictly necessary, but it will greatly simplify things if we do this in Rhino, as opposed to trying to fix it later in Unity, is we want to assign texture coordinates. And what that means is there's another way of saying assigning the UV parameters for texturing. That's basically saying giving instructions for how to apply a texture to this geometry in terms of how dense it is and whether or not the concrete patterning here needs to match the concrete patterning here, and etc. And this will vary depending on the building geometry. In the case of the Carpenter Center, we have a very dominant material of concrete, and essentially we want all the concrete to appear the same texture, the same density, and the same material properties. So that simplifies things, that we can basically apply a homogeneous texture mapping to all of the concrete elements of this structure. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's first go through and expand all these layer trees, and turn off everything that isn't concrete. So for example, the railings on the ramp, the landings are going to be concrete. This mesh is not, treads are. The columns are concrete, walls are concrete, glazing's not, mullions are not. And we'll just do that. Okay, so that looks like about it. Everything left in the model here is to be rendered as concrete. So what we can do is, also this will be a different material. So, okay, so these are all the concrete materials. What we can do is select everything in the file and assign a texture mapping. So here you see properties, material, and then texture mapping is the third one. And with all the geometry selected at the same time, we want to assign a box mapping, which is this one here that looks like a cube. So then we get in the command line options here. We can specify a specific box mapping. We're just going to do bounding box based on the world coordinates. In this case, our world coordinates are the same as the C-plane coordinates because we didn't change anything. We do want it to be capped, and that's that. it's now giving us this dialog box here where we can change the parameters of the box. So we of course want it to be boxed. We can turn on a visualization of what that box looks like. Which again, this doesn't strictly mean anything, but it kind of gives us a visualization of what this is encompassing. So you can imagine this bounding box surrounding this geometry, and on each of these faces of the bounding box, if you can imagine just a wallpaper of that concrete texture that we're going to be using later, and then it's just projecting that texture onto the closest surfaces in the model, and so it will basically give us an effect of a seamless texture, seamless concrete texture over all of the model. There are some other parameters we can look at here, but nothing that we need to change. This is basically just telling us the size of that bounding box, and we would, if we were rendering in Rhino, we would probably want to change the UVW repeat. However, that we can edit in Unity in this case. What we are doing here is just making sure it's a homogeneous texture mapping that we can increase the density of later, but the important thing is that leaving Rhino, the texture coordinates are homogeneous related to each other. And now that we've assigned the texture coordinates for the concrete elements of the building, we can do the same thing for the glass and for the railings and for this ground texture. However, we can also skip that step because variations in the homogeneity of those textures are minimal. So we're going to go ahead and skip that. We'll just deal with that in Unity. So now I know that my Rhino model consists of closed solids with the normals facing outwards, and my layers are organized by material. And for every important material in the model, I've created a uniform texture mapping. That information will also be exported to Unity. So now that's basically ready to be exported. I'm going to go ahead and create a new Unity file. So I'm just going to double click on Unity, and then I will go through the process of making a new folder structure. So I'll be doing all of this from scratch. So I'm going to make a new project, and I can specify a file location. So I can do documents, Carpenter Center, and it asks me if I want to import the following packages. I'll import the character controller, and that's probably it. Skyboxes and everything else we don't really need. It's not super important. A lot of these I've just downloaded myself, and these packages you can choose to import later. You don't have to necessarily import everything at the onset. So I'm just going to create the new folder. So that made a new folder in my documents directory, and just making a new Unity project, including those assets that we just checked. I know that, and I also feel the same way, that the whole file structure that is involved with using Unity is a bit of a turnoff. It seems unnecessarily complicated when you first start working with Unity. And it's very easy to get your directories all cluttered with extra files that you're not actually using, or just to keep a steady grasp on what's actually doing what in the file structure. So I'll try to make sense of that as much as possible, but it is still a sort of a source of frustration even for me. So by default, Unity is created 4 folders in my Carpenter Center directory. There's assets, library, product settings, and temp. I don't really use anything in any of the folders except for assets. So by default it's created a standard assets directory, which includes the Unity package called standard assets. In addition to that, let's make new folders, one called materials, one called models, and if we had a lot of different textures, we could make a separate textures folder. In this case, I'm just going to throw textures into the materials folder, and we'll be able to keep that straight because we only have 4 different materials in this file. So within the models folder, it says empty now, but this is where I'm going to want to export my Rhino building as an OBJ. So what's going to happen is I'm just going to export all this geometry as an OBJ to this location, and that will always be referenced by this Unity project. So if I make a change later on in the Rhino file, I can just re-export that file to this OBJ directory, and it'll automatically update any changes while preserving most of the structure and the materials that I had already previously set. So back in Rhino, I'm going to select all of my geometry, making sure that all the layers are turned on. So select everything and export. And again, I am in Carpenter Center, and under the assets folder, I created a folder called models, and I'm going to call this Carpenter. And then I want to check the options for this model. I'm going to export it as a mesh. Unity only accepts meshes, it doesn't accept NURBS geometries. End-of-line characters, for me, I'm using Windows. I'm assuming that's always Windows. Anyway, and this is important here. Export Rhino object names as OBJ objects. And export Rhino layer group names as layers as OBJ objects. So again, what that's doing is that's making an OBJ object for each layer here, including each layer in the layer tree. So that means that in Unity, each layer here will be an object that I can work with independently. Vertexes should be welded, and this is also important. Make sure to export the mesh texture coordinates. That's what we just set with the bounding box for the concrete. Vertex normals in order to preserve that directionality. Material definitions, and we also need to map the Rhino Z to OBJY. By default, OBJ considers the Y-axis to be vertical. So we are actually going to always use these settings, but it doesn't hurt to just make sure and just check every time we export. So say OK, save, have to say OK again. And we can specify the level to which we want to mesh these NURBS surfaces. This isn't too important in this case. We don't have very detailed geometry, so somewhere here is fine. So this will take a little while, but this is exporting this geometry to that specific file location in Unity, and then we'll be able to import that into Unity in just a minute. Okay, so now that it's exported from Rhino, you can see these folders that already appeared in the directory in the Unity file. And we'll go over the interface in just a minute. But it's starting to import this Rhino file into this models folder. So still nothing happened in the Unity screen. But if we check in our models folder, we now have a Carpenter Center. We can just go ahead and click and drag that in, and it's just in an arbitrary location that we'll need to fix. But there's our Rhino model. And a quick note, we were working in meters in Rhino, and by default, meters is the preferred unit for Unity 3D. So if you're working in meters in Rhino and then exporting as an OBJ, you shouldn't need to scale anything when you bring it into Unity. So the Unity interface is, again, perhaps a bit disorienting. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of windows that you need to keep open. It's certainly easier if you have multiple monitors to be able to throw some of these windows on another screen, but this is the layout that I prefer, which is, I believe, the 2x3. No. The 4 split. No. The default. So I prefer to kind of keep my interface looking something like this. I like to see the scene and the game at the same time. The hierarchy is particularly important. You can expand this to see all of again, these are relating to what were layers in Rhino. They're now OBJ objects in the Unity file. The project menu, which is just kind of a directory. The console, which we won't really need to look at too much. And then the inspectors, it's also quite important here. So just try to make sure that you have all these windows visible. So if we have our Carpenter Center model selected, and we can select that in the hierarchy here, we just put it in an arbitrary location. But I want to change these position variables here on the right to 0, 0, 0. That way, if we decide to import something else in later from the model, maybe just a small piece, we can import it with the same origin, and then it will appear in the appropriate location in the file. So I think that's a good place to conclude the first part of this tutorial. So we've successfully gotten geometry from Rhino into Unity 3D, and we're ready to move on to texturing, lighting, and environment in the next video.